Hello, wrestling fans. We have a special treat for you today. We're going to be doing a book review. Actually, it's about 3 book reviews in one of the AWA record book series. And we actually are here with one of the authors of the book, George Schire, who is a great wrestling historian, especially with AWA wrestling. And so he's written other books too. But today we're going to concentrate on the AWA record book series. Right now, the 1960s are out, the early 70s, and the late 70s, part 1 and 2 of the 1970s. So, George, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, it's fun to be on. It's always great to talk wrestling, Tim.
Yeah, well, that's what my listeners want too. Is just a lot of wrestling. We're gonna try, hopefully, tell some stories, get to know these books a little bit more, so that people can come out and buy them if they want to, and learn more about. I mean, in the last 5 to 10 years, these record book type things have really gotten popular, and I know they've made some for almost all the organizations, at least all the organizations that we have records for. But for the AWA, there's nobody that I would trust more than you to compile these record books. And so can you just give us an idea of where this project got started and what you did?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for saying you trust me more than anyone. I'll take that as a great compliment. You know, Tim, the one thing about wrestling results, I guess maybe we should talk about first, is you are correct. There are a lot of books that have come down the pike in the last decade or so, many of them pretty much results or history-oriented. And the important thing for me is that if I'm going to do a book, I want to be sure that the results that I've included or the history that I've included is accurate. That's first and foremost. If I can't verify it or if I have any doubt whatsoever that a result or a name or something in the book may not be right, I would rather, and I have done this, I would rather not include it and save it until it can be verified with a second printing of the book or something along those lines. Because it's important that when the reader gets it, it's something that he or she can count on as being factual, and that's most important. And there are many books that are out. I would rather focus for just a moment when we talk about wrestling history and wrestling results. If you go to the internet today, which is something we didn't have or I didn't have, you know, I've been around this wrestling business for, boy, I'll tell you what, about 55 years, which makes me 106 years old, I'll tell you that. But the one thing I know about the internet today is that there are a lot of websites, a lot of wrestling websites that have title histories, they have results on those sites, and I can tell you with 100% guarantee that many of those sites have inaccurate information. A lot of times what happens is there are people that put these sites up that either A, weren't around when all of this stuff was going on, and now they're just researching it and they're getting information from this guy and that guy, and they go ahead and post it without first being able to verify that it indeed took place. And so when you go to the internet, I always tell people, proceed with caution. The old story, don't believe everything that you read on the internet because it's not always true. Now, that said, I could say the same thing about some books that are published. A lot of times people, I've seen it over the past 20 years or so, people will publish a book, and it seems that it's more important that they publish a book or can say that they have published a book than it is to assure that the contents of the book are accurate. And again, that's the most important part to me. If there are errors in the book, then to me the book isn't worth the price or the energy to read it. And I know this is off topic just a little bit, but when we're talking about these books, I think it's around 20 years ago or so now, there was a book called the Territorial Illustrated History of Professional Wrestling or something along those lines. I know that the person that wrote it, his last name was Lentz, Lentz, I believe. And I will tell you that if you put this book on your bookshelf, it's an awesome looking book. The cover is very nicely done. It's a nice hardcover book. But that's where it ends. Because when you open up that book, and I'm not exaggerating, and I have nothing to, no axe to grind with Lentz, but when you open the book, there are page after page, entry after entry in the book of incorrect information. And I have many times over the years had to point this out to people when they've referenced his book. So whatever his sources were or whatever his informational background was, I can only tell you that the book is not worth the paper it's printed on. So that's what I point out is that, and it's just important that the books are correct. Now, all of this said, it is virtually impossible to never have an error in a book or on a website or something of that nature. By nature, by human nature, we are all going to have something that at some point maybe needs to be corrected or investigated. But bottom line with all of this, Tim, is that any time throughout close to 40 years that I've been doing wrestling research on not only the AWA, but all of wrestling in the United States, it has been utmost importance to me to assure that it is correct before I pass that information on to someone else. And I will tell you this, I am not at all ashamed or bashful when it comes to taking someone to task if they've insisted that something they printed is correct when it is not. So there you go. Well, it's just important to me that stuff be accurate.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. And as I've dabbled as now getting into the media wrestling world, it is, and the temptation's there. I mean, it's like you want to be the person who comes out with a book or comes out with webisodes. I mean, we the more webisodes you get out, the more viewers you're going to have, the more subscribers you're going to have and stuff. But yeah, at the same time, you don't want to sacrifice the truth, and you don't want to sacrifice good journalism just to have your name on more items and stuff like that. And I think that is, I mean, the internet is good and bad, and I know there's been many discussions on this in many different forums that it's great. It's a great, like you said, you didn't have the internet when you grew up, and for me, it was, I guess, partially is I kind of grew up into the internet age, as I've lived both with it and without it, and it's got so many good things and yet so many bad things, and I think overall the good probably outweighs the bad, but there are a lot of bad things. Yeah, there's just anyone can put an article out there about anything, and so many people just end up believing it. That, I mean, that's the joke. Oh, it's on the internet, it must be true. But in the professional wrestling world, it's like, who knows where these wrestling things are coming from? And if they're opinions, that's great. But if someone's trying to pass off something for fact, that kind of makes it hard. And some of these writers, I know that they use people to email them results from various things with no backup of, it's just anyone can email results, and I'm sure most of them do it and want to have a correct history of it, but at the same time, some of them probably don't worry that much about the accuracy. Oh, I remember what happened at the matches I was at, and how well do they remember something that happened 2 or 3 years ago? There's definitely, I've seen errors in results books and stuff like that, but overall they're a great resource to have, even with a few errors in them. But yeah, the errors are kind of hard, because then you're reading it as truth, and then you find out it's not. So that's one of the reasons I appreciate your book so much, because I know that if the result's in there, then you know for sure that happened the way it says it in the book, and we can count on that if we're doing any kind of research into people's careers or the history of buildings or whatever else the research that needs to be done.
Well, and again, Tim, I want to just clarify that by no means, by everything I said a few moments ago, do I want to come as being absolutely perfect or anything like that, because like everyone else in our world, I am not perfect. I make mistakes. And our old wrestling announcer, Roger Kent, he used to say that's the reason they put erasers on pencils, because we make mistakes. And that's very true. The one thing about professional wrestling that I learned early on, when I go back to the 60s, for some reason I've been reflecting a lot on the 60s wrestling in the past couple months, and mainly because I realize now that it's 50 years ago. And at that point in time, I was 14, 15, 16, 17 years old in those 60s years. And so I remember all of these things, but the one thing I've learned is that first and foremost, we have to know that pro wrestling, by its very nature, back in the kayfabe era, in the old school wrestling, the promoters and the wrestlers, they didn't want fans to remember anything beyond the wrestling card or the last couple cards that they promoted. And they would go out of their way to make you forget. Strangely enough, and I've always found this to be really strange, is that wrestling fans often did not remember things. And like you mentioned a moment ago, you say, well, they go to a wrestling card, and then 2 months later they're trying to recall who they saw, or they're remembering, and 2 years from now they're remembering it differently than what happened, or the dates, or who was on the card. And I find that to be true with a good portion of the wrestling fan environment. There are very few that really took it seriously to write things down and to document it, because all they were doing was going to a wrestling card. That was it. They had fun. They were there with their friends. They yelled and screamed. They booed for the bad guys, cheered for the good guys. You know, spilt their beer on their wrestling program, and it ended up on the floor, and when they went home, they had a great time. And then 5 years from now, they're recalling something that, well, I remember this, or I thought it was that, and so every once in a while, there's a weird duck like me that comes along, and I've got a lot of buddies in this business, so many great historians. I could rattle off 15, 20 of them, but a lot of fans listening will know who these guys are, and I'm not going to start rattling off names. But we're kind of a strange breed, because we took it a little bit more seriously, that though the promotions didn't want us to remember, the wrestling promoters and wrestlers themselves, we as fans, the historian type, we do recall it, and we recorded it, we saved the programs, we saved the magazines, we saved the old fan club bulletins, the old results sheets that were around, and we stayed in communication with one another, and we share with one another so that, you know, we can verify results and names and territorial histories. And in doing that, we have now recorded wrestling history, and we'll continue to do it. I will do it until I'm no longer on the planet. And we do it because we love it and because we want it right. And I wanted to mention to you, when you said about the internet, when people read something, and it doesn't matter whether it's the internet or in a book, if they read it, they say, well, here it is right here in black and white, and they take it as fact. There are times, as I mentioned, that isn't the truth. One thing that really pops up a lot, and I'll clarify this for you right now, and I point this out in my AWA 60s record book. One of the greatest misconceptions out there is that Pat O'Connor was the first AWA World Heavyweight Champion. There's websites out there with title history websites. There have been other books that have been published. People have said this. Truth be told, and I do again, I explain this in my 60s record book, Pat O'Connor was not, capital letters, not, the first AWA World Champion. Vern Gagne was. But here's where the problem comes in. This is where people get confused, and this is why it has become tangled over the decades. In March of 1960, Minneapolis, which was the AWA, what became the AWA. Let's clarify this by saying that The AWA was always known as the Minneapolis office or the Minneapolis territory. That's what all of the wrestlers, people in the business called it. It was really never AWA. It was the Minneapolis territory. A wrestler will tell you, I went to work for Minneapolis, which means they were working all of the cities that encompass the AWA. Now, back to Pat O'Connor. So in March of 1960, the Minneapolis office was still under the promotional jurisdiction of the National Wrestling Alliance. They started to put in the wrestling programs Sports Facts in Minneapolis and Wrestling Facts in St. Paul, the programs respectively for those cities. And they started mentioning this on All-Star Wrestling, that Vern Gagne wanted to have a chance at the World Heavyweight Champion, Pat O'Connor. And at that time, Pat O'Connor was the National Wrestling Alliance NWA World Champion. So then we move forward to May of 1960. There is promotional things on TV on All-Star Wrestling, and there are things that are put into the two respective programs that the promoters, basically being Wally Carbo, but the promoters have issued an ultimatum to National Wrestling Alliance Pat O'Connor to defend his championship to Vern Gagne within 90 days, or Carbo and other AW or other promoters, there was no AWA yet in May of 1960, other promoters would no longer recognize Pat as the world champion. So I think that's where the confusion comes in. Then we move ahead those 90 days, from May to August. It is declared that Pat O'Connor and the National Wrestling Alliance has not even commented on giving Vern Gagne, the number one challenger, a chance at the championship. So by default, Vern Gagne is now recognized as the first AWA, American Wrestling Alliance, world champion. So people, when they look at that type of scenario, they automatically think that Pat O'Connor was the first AWA champion. I've seen that printed. I've seen that written on internet pages. And, of course, it's on many websites. And it's wrong. So I took it upon myself in the first AWA record book, the 60s, to actually explain that in the foreword, how that came about.
Well, there's some great wrestling history right there, and yeah, that's just amazing, and that's the kind of history that so many of us want to see kept alive and learn and everything else like that. So just one follow-up question on that. So did the AWA know at the time that this is what was going to happen, or was there a chance, could Pat O'Connor have done something that would have satisfied them, or do they pretty much know this is where we're going to be breaking off and we want to use this as an excuse?
Well, there again, this is professional wrestling, and you have to remember what I said earlier, Tim, that promoters and promotions, by their very nature, they only wanted fans to believe what they told them. Now, there was never, the key word is never, there was never any, even the slightest remote chance that Pat O'Connor was going to defend the NWA title to Vern Gagne in Minneapolis or any of the AWA, what became the AWA in 1960, any of their territories. So Pat O'Connor, it was merely a storyline. It was something to give the fans to read when they went to the matches in the programs, and they could talk on TV that the world champion, the NWA world champion, is dodging Vern Gagne. But the NWA, here's the part of the story that fans didn't know, is that the NWA had already agreed before, around May of 1960, to give up the Minneapolis territory to Vern Gagne and Wally Carbo, basically saying that Vern and Wally were going into business for themselves. Vern was starting his own promotion, and calling it the American Wrestling Alliance. And just a side note to that, it was the American Wrestling Alliance in the beginning and through most of the 60s. Then somehow, without any fanfare, without any announcement or anything, they just started calling it the American Wrestling Association. And that's what it ended up as up until the day they officially went out of business. But it was American Wrestling Alliance in the beginning. But the NWA was under investigation by the Justice Department for having a controlling wrestling and for having a monopoly on the business by having only one champion and working with promotions to only have one champion. So part of the problem or part of the situation was they had agreed, the NWA had agreed to give up Minneapolis. And so there's where the storyline comes in. Vern just creates this fictional storyline that he has challenged the NWA champion, Pat O'Connor, and there was never an intent for a match. Behind the scenes, the NWA had just agreed to give up Minneapolis. And in August, after the 90 days expired, Vern Gagne is announced as the first world champion by default. But that's where fans come up with this Pat O'Connor was the first champion because he refused to meet Vern. And I just can't tell you how many times I've seen that stated. And it's because people go to an internet site or someone else has told them or they've heard it, and it just gets spread. So it's like one of those stories that I tell you we have to keep putting the fire out all the time and trying to make, correct it as it comes along. But as I said, too, I explained that very much in depth at the very beginning of the AWA record book, the 60s.
Yeah, actually,
I thought that was important.
We need to get into that book. I have one more follow-up question, and then I do want to get into that book a little bit more. How did the wrestling magazines at the time react to the story when they broke off, when Vern broke off? I'm guessing, would like Wrestling Review been out at that time, and maybe Boxing and Wrestling Illustrated, and a couple more of those other, did they run them all as kayfabe stories, and this is actually happening, or what happened there? Do you remember anything like that?
Well, you have to remember, too, that back in those days, the wrestling magazines were more fictional than the wrestling business was because the stories were all created. They actually manifested stories about the wrestling characters, a certain heel or a certain baby face, and they made fictional stories about them. But there was never really any mention of it. The thing that was important is that I started watching wrestling, and I was a pretty young kid at the time, but let's just go back to about 1956 or 57. And I was pretty little, but you know what? They never talked on TV on All-Star Wrestling, which we got in the Twin Cities market here, Minneapolis and St. Paul. They never mentioned the National Wrestling Alliance per se. It was always the world champion was coming to town. And I remember that Lou Thesz was in Minneapolis when he was NWA champion. I remember that Dick Hutton, when he became NWA champion, he appeared in Minneapolis in 1959. And then, of course, Pat O'Connor did have some defenses, in 1959, early 60, after he had taken the title from Hutton. But the promotions and the magazines, they never really had a difference between them. The thing about the wrestling magazines in that era and into the 60s is when you bought a wrestling magazine from the drugstore or the newsstand, it basically just covered a territory or a city, and they talked about the wrestlers in that city, and they might mention that so-and-so was the Southern champion or so-and-so was the Pacific Coast champion or whatever it might have been. They really didn't put any designation, though. But in the early 60s, when the AWA became a reality, now we had two wrestling alliances, NWA and the AWA. And then if you just move ahead a little bit to 1963, we now had the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, the WWWF, which came into existence. And then in 1964, we had the World Wrestling Association, which was the Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder's wrestling group out of Indiana. And then there was another WWA out in California a little bit earlier, which consisted in California and some of those cities. So then it started to break off. But before that, they didn't really designate. They would just talk about a territory and put the names on them, but never really highlighting AWA or NWA. As the 60s moved on, then it became a little more divided, and they started putting what they called their official ratings in the magazines, and the AWA would list 10 challengers and a champion. The NWA would list a champion and 10 challengers, and so on with the other groups. Funny thing about that is that though the wrestlers really did work in those respective territories at the time of publication of the books and the magazines, the truth be told is the promotions and the promoters, they never issued any official ratings or rankings of wrestlers. So what they put in the magazines that they called official were really nothing more than the opinions of the editors and the writers of the magazine. And it just made for interesting reading. And I'll tell you what, as a kid, I remember going to the magazine and turning to that ratings page and looking and saying, oh, wow, look at Reggie Parks is number 6. He's rated number 6, you know. And I think that's what it was. It was more for conversation.
Exactly. I mean, and me in the 80s, then when, I mean, that's what I did as a kid in the 80s, would run, and we probably had 3 or 4 different magazines, and I didn't buy one even every month, but you could still go to the newsstand. We had a supermarket that carried many magazines, and so every month I'd go to the newsstand, and the first thing I would do is take it off the newsstand and turn to the ratings section just to see where everything was rated, and because then sometimes you even learned about a title change maybe in a smaller promotion that we didn't have TV for and stuff like that, and that was always my favorite section. So even 20 years later, the rating section still meant a lot, and I'm sure they're still done the same way. It's just kind of, I think they had a little bit maybe more, but I don't think WWF or AWA were putting out official ratings. They were just, whoever the editors of the magazines were rating them based on how they were doing, and usually like the second champion, like the Intercontinental Champion, U.S. Champion, or Television Champion, or whatever, was usually ranked like right below the Heavyweight Champion, and then just probably the number 1 contender to the Heavyweight title, and so on down the line, and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean that's lasted years until they stopped pretty much making magazines, and that's one of the sad parts of the internet, is I sure miss the magazines.
Well, and the magazines were good for the fact that, you know, I remember going and picking up Wrestling Review when it came out on the newsstand, or Wrestling World, or any of them that were of the 60s. And it was fun when you went to the drugstore, because drugstores in those days had a big news magazine stand, and, you know, you could pick up your latest magazines. But it was fun when you went there and when you looked through the magazine and you'd come across some names that, number one, it may be a name that you remember from working in your territory, and now he's been gone for a while, and you say, oh, wow, look, he's down in Florida. He's the Southern champion, according to the magazine. And then there were the times when you saw wrestlers in there that never came to your territory, and because they got media coverage, because they'd be in a couple or 3 issues a year of a certain magazine, you learned to kind of like that wrestler, and you'd hope that someday you could see him. And I'll give you an example. One guy and he's one of my all-time favorite wrestlers. I have a very small list of personal all-time favorites, because I get people that say, well, who's your all-time favorite? I have tons of favorite wrestlers, but I only have a list of about 5 that are guys of, they are my favorites, personal favorites over everybody else. One of those guys is a guy named Billy Red Lyons. Now, let me tell you a story about Billy Red Lyons. In the 60s, I would see Billy Red Lyons' name in Wrestling Review, and we'll just talk about that magazine, with many of the others as well, but we'll just use Review. I'd see Billy's name in Review, and I'd see that he was wrestling in California, or I'd see that he was in Buffalo, New York, or all of a sudden he was in Texas, in the cities there. And I started getting wrestling programs from a lot of the territories and started collecting them. I worked out trade arrangements where I'd send them the St. Paul and Minneapolis wrestling cards in exchange for getting a Dallas program or a Fort Worth program or a San Francisco program, you name it. And I started seeing Billy Red Lyons in these programs. And he just became one of those guys that was like, I hope I get to see him someday. You know, I think he'd be good to see. So one night in August of 1968, it's been a year now, in 1968, that Dr. X, the masked man in the AWA, was beating everybody and keeping his mask. On a TV match in August of 68, they have Dr. X and his opponent comes into the ring, and he is announced as Billy Red Lyons. I remember being 17 or 16 years old, whatever I was. I remember being so excited. It was like, oh my gosh, you know. And here was Billy Red Lyons. Now the deal was they had brought Billy Red into the AWA, and they put him in this TV match against Dr. X, who was the biggest heel we had, the biggest bad guy, and everybody, you know, fans were always hoping that someone was going to take his mask off, because that was the whole gimmick behind the mask. And here was Billy Red Lyons. And I remember thinking, I've seen Billy in all these Texas programs, and I've seen Billy out in California. This is incredible. And Billy Red, on that TV match, he beat Dr. X in that TV match. And it was like, this is the biggest news ever. Part of the mystique of Billy is that what fans didn't know, and it was never revealed, and even if someone did know it, the promotion and the wrestlers themselves would have denied it. But the fact is that Billy Red Lyons was the real-life brother-in-law of Dr. X. Dick Beyer was Dr. X, wrestler by the name of Dick Beyer. And before he became Dr. X in the AWA, in 1967, he had wrestled all over the country and in Japan under a different mask, calling himself the Destroyer. But he and Billy Red Lyons were real-life brother-in-laws. But the deal was that Billy was always a babyface, and Dick Beyer was always a heel. And they had matches against each other in Texas. They actually did team in California, but they had matches together, and they had great chemistry, and it was a great feud for the promoters. So fans didn't know that Billy was Dick's brother-in-law, but it was fantastic. And so once I learned that little behind-the-scenes thing, my interest in wrestling was just intrigued, trying to find out results and histories and different things of these guys. I had a great opportunity in 1967 where Marty O'Neill, who was the All-Star Wrestling TV announcer in Minneapolis, he allowed me or asked me if I'd like to come along and ride with him to some spot shows. Now, a spot show in wrestling was a wrestling card in a small town, you know, maybe at the high school gym of a town or something like that, and they put on a small wrestling card. They called them spot shows. And I did. I started riding with Marty during the summer, and Marty would tell me things, but then he'd say, "No, you better not say anything about that," or something like that. And I'd just say, "Okay, Marty, I'm not going to say a word." And I started to learn little things without really being told, and sometimes just reading into what he said. And maybe he didn't really tell me anything, but I remember one time I said to him in the car, I said, Marty, isn't it weird that nobody knows who Dr. X is? And he reminds me a lot of the Destroyer. And Marty replied something to the effect of, yeah, it's kind of funny that nobody figures stuff out. Never really told me yes or no, but what he said is, guess what? You're right. And then I would just take it from there. But those are the little things. Wrestling history, the promoters just didn't want people to know. and they relied on fans to have short memories. I'll give you an example. You go to Chicago in October of 1967, Dr. X wrestles against Vern Gagne. And if you go just a couple months earlier, same city, Vern Gagne wrestled against the Destroyer. And I'll tell you what, I have never come across a fan that knew at the time that Dr. X and the Destroyer were the same person. Fans just didn't know. It's weird, but they didn't.
Yeah, and that's one of the nice things about wearing a mask. I remember talking to Bill White one time, and he wrestled like 5 different times. I think there was a snowstorm or something, and he wrestled 5 times in 5 different matches in one night as 5 different characters, and they just put a different color mask on him, changed his tights and stuff like that, and so Bill White would be coming out as a different masked character, and I mean, yeah, I don't think that was what they wanted to always do, but like I said, and I think there was a blizzard, and they lost like half of their crew for the night, and they had to make something for all the fans. And it's amazing that many fans still come out in the blizzard. That shows how dedicated they were, so they didn't want to disappoint those fans.
Well, and I'll tell you an example. In 1967, there was a wrestler that came to the AWA, and they called him Big Luke. And it was Luke Brown was his last name, but Big Luke. And he was billed from Muleshoe, Kentucky. I don't even know if there's really a town called Muleshoe, but he was from Muleshoe, and then eventually they started saying he was from Hazard, Kentucky. But he was like a hillbilly wrestler. He'd come in with a pair of blue jeans on with a rope around the waist for a belt, and he had long hair and a beard, and he would, he called his wrestling scuffling. He didn't call it wrestling. He'd tell Marty O'Neill that I don't wrestle, I scuffle. Well, they brought him in 67, and they put a lot of fanfare around him that we've got this new star from Kentucky, Big Luke, and he's strong as a bull, that sort of thing. But what fans didn't realize was that in 1960, Big Luke was here in Minneapolis. He was wrestling under the name of Don Man Mountain Campbell. And he had a crew cut and a very trimmed beard and dressed differently, and he was a totally different character. But, here 6 years later, they don't remember him. And it was not only that, I guess sometimes I'd say the fan base changes, because sometimes there were fans that would get involved with going to the matches for maybe 6 months to a year because they were, enthralled in a certain feud or liked certain wrestler. And then eventually life got in the way and they quit going. So fans, promoters could throw that out there and realize that wrestlers would not be recognized. Another example in Minneapolis was in 1958 and 59. In Minneapolis, we had Reggie and Stan Lisowski brothers coming through Minneapolis. And then in 1962, there's another new brother combination called Art and Stan Nielsen. And what fans never realized was that Stan Nielsen was Stan Lisowski, and he had just taken on a different brother. And of course, he really wasn't a Lisowski or a Nielsen. His real name was Stan Hollick, Holek. But that's the way wrestling worked, and promoters relied on fans to have short memories, and they relied on you not remembering, and they really only wanted you to remember what they wanted you to remember, if it involved a certain program or certain wrestlers right now. And that's what made the business fun.
Yeah, and without the internet, it was a lot easier, but yet at the same time, yeah, it was just a whole different ball game there. But those are just amazing stories from the 60s. And so actually, I want to give your book a plug. I mean, as you've been telling these stories, and this is why I love your books. I've been following along through the AWA record book of the 1960s, and I mean, it's just the one thing I noticed is every few pages or years, you would show one of those. You said they had the different programs, the wrestling facts and the sports facts out of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and you showed some covers and stuff from the various years. How often? I'm assuming, is that the program that came when you went to an AWA show? Is that the program that you would get?
Right. They would sell the programs, and most wrestling promotions around the United States, on the night of the wrestling card, they would have their version, their local program, where they would tell stories about the wrestlers and about the matches that were taking place that night. And they would have the lineup page, that showed the matches, the Crusher against Furpo in the main event, and then whatever else was on the card. They were relatively cheap back in the day. They were a 4-page pamphlet, if you want to call it that. Basically a big sheet of paper folded over into 4 pages, and they used to charge, like a dime or 25 cents. I think the most I ever saw them go up to in some of the cities I visited or got programs from, they were up to about 50 cents. And then in the early 70s, most of the promotions quit doing those type of programs, and a lot of them were just going with either a magazine that they were selling or putting together, or a lot of it was the wrestling news magazines with just an insert in the magazine with the lineup on it. But those programs were fun to collect. I feel very fortunate that I still have every program that I ever collected from not only the Twin Cities, and I started going to matches in the late 50s, and I have every program I ever attended, plus all of those that I didn't as a kid. I didn't always get to go as a kid, part of it because I had to rely on someone to get me there. But once I was able to get my driver's license, I became a maniac, and I was driving all over the place and going to cards in different cities. And that's when I started doing results, which kind of led up to what these books became. I used to spend hours, and I do mean hours upon hours a week, going to the local library or in my school library when I was still in school, and I would go through newspapers from a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Whenever I knew there had been wrestling in a city, I would go and look up the newspapers of those wrestling cards, and I would get results that were printed in the newspapers and see clippings and stories and that sort of thing. So doing the research early on, like I say, we didn't have the internet in those days, and we had to rely on the newspapers, and that's really how I got my start. So one of the things that I wanted to do is I said, you know what, we need to record the entire AWA history as far as results and cards go. And since I have them all and I can verify them, and I'm also still gaining results as I go along. My AWA book, the record book, if I were to do a second printing of it right now, I could probably come out with maybe another 40 or 50 cards that were not included in that book.
Okay, and we're talking the 19th.
Research, and some of them I've been able to verify that I didn't include originally because I couldn't verify that they were accurate. Sometimes you'll find a wrestler on a card, and you'll say, well, that can't be possible because on this particular night he was in Tampa wrestling. So, one of the two results, either the Tampa one or the Minneapolis one, is incorrect. Or the, Des Moines, Iowa one is incorrect. Whatever the AWA encompassed a lot of cities. And so if I can't verify that it really took place, then I didn't include it. But if I were to redo it right now, I'd probably have about another 50 cards, give or take. And I could put them in there. And at some point, I will do that. The thing about collecting results is you're never done. It's absolutely, there's no way to say you'll ever be done. One of the things that I've done, Tim, and I don't think a lot of people know this, maybe you do, I don't think you do though, is I have compiled and researched the individual wrestling results histories of probably about 40 or 50 wrestlers over the last decade or so. From their whole careers, from when they started to when they ended. And what's really fun about that, and this is what I learned, is that I can look, and I'll give you, we'll start with Vern Gagne, for example. You do Vern Gagne's pro wrestling career record, and you see that he made his debut on May 3rd, 1949 in Minneapolis against Abe King Kong Cashy. Well, then you look at every city, every town, every match that he had along the way, and they tell a story. You can see the travels that he did. You know, the man was, in the 50s, Vern Gagne was all over the United States. I mean, he traveled. You know, he earned his way into, you know, becoming a champion. He just didn't have it handed to him, as a lot of people would think, when he owned his own company, because he had the credentials. But the truth be told is, it's fun to look at these results because they tell a story. You get to see when he was in a tag team match and his partner turned on him, and then next week they're feuding each other. And then you go to the next town in a different part of the country, and you say, whoa, now they're a tag team again. Well, fans didn't know in that era. Our world was very small in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even into the 90s, because if you saw two guys wrestling in Minneapolis, fans had no way of knowing, for the most part. You didn't have any way of knowing that maybe last night in St. Louis, they were tag team partners. But tonight, in your city, they're in a cage match against each other. And I mean, that's the way wrestling worked. Promoters were safe because fans didn't really have resources to find this stuff out. And now, in hindsight, most of the old wrestlers, you know, and we've lost, oh boy, we have lost so many wrestlers in the past 10 years from the golden age, as I call it. But these guys, they would say, man, I wish I would have bought programs, or I wish I'd have saved magazines, or I wish I'd have saved my results. And they really appreciate goofballs like me and Tom Burke and Mark James and so many others that have done results research, that now it means something to them. And that's where this whole AWA record series came out of. I just thought, you know what? I think it would be fun to have all the matches, all the cards. And what's fun about it is, for example, the Crusher. He came to the AWA in 1962. He was given a huge push as a heel. And what's fun about the results is you get to see all of his matches, how he progresses, who he feuds with, who he loses to or gets disqualified against, who he wins with, who he teams with, and then you see him turn good guy, and then you see him wrestle these other wrestlers, and it's just fun to follow the history. So results tell stories. And what happened with my 60s book, and let me tell your listeners here that we're officially talking about the AWA record book, the 60s, and then I do have the follow-up books, 2 books for the 70s. Because by the 70s, the AWA had gotten so big, and there were more cards held each year and more cities promoted in. So it ended up being 2 books.
If everything goes good with the edits, that's what my listeners are seeing on the screen right now. I have a copy of, you can see the cover on the screen, so you know what books George is talking about, and I've been flipping through them as we've been going along here. So those are the books that George is talking about right now.
And what I did in the 60s book is I did just include, before each decade, I included 1 copy of a program from that particular decade. So one for the 60s, I had 1 program posted for 1961, 1 for 62, and so on. Well, one of the things that I got feedback on was from people that bought the book. They said, you know, we'd love to see more of those programs, and we'd like to see more pictures of wrestlers. So when I did the first half of the 70s book, 1970 to 1974, I included many more program covers, and I included a lot of individual publicity wrestling photos of wrestlers that were inserted throughout the book. And then I also did the same thing for the second half of the 70s, 75 to 79, put more pictures and programs in there. And that also helped make the books a little bit bigger. and needing to, separate the decade. And now as I work on the 80s, that too, the first half of the 80s, I got to tell you, that's a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying working on it and putting the results together for it. And I've dabbled a little bit into the second half of the 80s as well, and I'm already telling you that that's not as much fun for me because by that time in our history, the AWA was starting to decline, as was all territorial wrestling, and all of the reasons for that are going to be explained in that second half edition of the 80s. But right now, if fans are interested in these record books, it's the AWA record book, the 60s, and then the 70s Part 1, 1975 to 79, and 70s Part 2. That's Part 1, 1970 to 74, and then Part 2 is 75 to 79. They are available on Amazon.com, and you can get them. I think they make great presents for somebody who's really into history of wrestling. And it also, for if nothing else, it kind of makes someone an authority. If they get into a conversation with their wrestling buddies, they can go to the book and they can say, hey, look at here, back in 1963, the Crusher wrestled Cowboy Jack Lanza. And then look at, in 1971, the Crusher's wrestling Blackjack Lanza. I mean, it's two different characters, but the reality is, it's fun to look at.
Or like you were just saying a few minutes ago, they can follow, if they had a favorite AWA wrestler, maybe during the 70s, they can follow his travels, and maybe it's one of the lesser known ones and not Vern Gant, but maybe they were a fan of somebody like Buddy Colt or something, and they can follow his travels and see everything else that he did and just go through it like that. And something I know I've told you this before too, and you mentioned it back to me then probably as part of the feedback is in the 70s to 74 you also include maybe a few more stories at the end of cards just of like historic things that happened or just something that the average fan might not have known but that you were able to tell, and you add those like as notes after the cards in both of your 1970s books, and that's something I really appreciated. I mean, the 60s book was great, but those cards in those little stories in the 70s, I think even make the 70s books that much even more exciting.
That was something that I also thought was interesting. I did have some people say they'd like to know a little bit more background, and so I did. I thought it was a great idea that when a wrestler came to the AWA, I maybe put a little bit of a trivia note about where he wrestled previously, or if he wrestled under a different name at a different territory, I would put that in there. That's kind of a fun thing. I enjoy doing those types of things because it kind of puts everything into reflective for the fans. And the books are really fun. Now, I do want to say they are available on Amazon. Obviously, you can get them by Christmas if you order them. If you look at the books, you say they're by George Schire, and it says Mark James on the cover. I want to give some credit to Mark James, but I also want to make something very clear. The books are published by Mark James. And Mark James, like myself, is a great historian. He has done a ton of stuff on other territories, specifically the Memphis wrestling territory. But Mark has published a lot of books. What I did was I went to Mark and I said, hey, I could use somebody to publish my books. I'll do all the research. I'll do all the content. I'll do all the pictures. I'll do all the trivia. And would you publish them? And that's the relationship that I have with Mark James. So even though it says my name and his name on the cover, Mark has nothing to do with any of the content within the book. It's all from my own collection. Now, Mark in his own right, I love this guy. Mark is awesome. He has published, like I said, some Memphis history books and several other wrestling books, and he's worked with other people like myself for their individual territories to come out with results books and that sort of thing. And again, Mark is the publisher in those cases, where he just agrees to publish them and put them out for us. But he certainly deserves all the kudos because he does the photo layout for the covers. I give him photos, he lays them out. He does all the content inside as far as organizing it. I just give him all the information. So we've got a great tag team on this, and it's really fun working with him.
Yeah, I mean, I actually got a chance to meet him a year ago at the NWA Fan Fest down in Charlotte, and I talked to. He was really busy because he was selling books of all. I know he had your books there that he was selling and stuff like that. But a nice guy, and we talked for a few minutes. And I told him I was from Minnesota, and we of course both knew you, and yeah, so nice guy. But yeah, the books are awesome. Yeah, and I agree with you. Would make great Christmas if you have that wrestling fan on your list. And maybe if you're listening to this channel, you have obviously some involvement in professional wrestling. These things are great. I mean, it's just hours and hours of fun reading, because it's like you can just go, like I said, you can find one wrestler and just kind of follow his career. You can find a city and see how often it came. Maybe it was a city that you grew up in, and find a card or two that you remember going to as a youngster, and the next thing you know is things will start coming back to you. Or maybe you're too young and one of these newer wrestling fans, but hey, this is a way that wrestling history is being kept up. And yeah, I mean, 3 of my favorite books in my wrestling collection, and I love books, and if you've listened to this channel enough, you know we've got a few other books in our collection, but honestly, these are 3 of my favorites. The only even small criticism I have is I miss the stories in the 60s books like they have in the 70s, part 1 and 2, but the 60s book still has a ton of facts in it, and the matches and everything else like that. And do we have a date on when the first 80s book is coming out?
Well, I wish I could give you a specific date, but, as soon as I say a date, then it's kind of a moving target.
Yeah.
Part of it is, I'm on no schedule to do these. So it's my own time, and there are times when I procrastinate and I have life get interfering in the way and that sort of thing. But I would, the second half of the 70s came out on May 31st of this year. And so we're only 6 months out, and I'm thinking maybe next spring, sometime maybe around May, if that would be a date to shoot for. But again, like I say, don't hold me to it because it could be a moving target. And I'm also working on another book unrelated to the wrestling results books that Mark James has agreed to publish for me. But this book, that's all I'm going to say at this point. It's going to be unrelated to results, but it's going to be a history. And I'm actually having more fun working on that book than I've had on any of my previous books. It's just something that's kind of personal to me about the wrestling business, and I decided to do a book on it. And so I'm hoping that comes out before the 80s books. And let me point something out, too. Though we've talked about how great these results books are from any territory, there is a very limited audience in these particular types of books. I've had people come up to me at book signings and say, "Oh, those are just matches," or "those are just wrestling cards," so they're not interested in it. So you're really cutting your market when you're trying to do results, because not everybody really gives a crap about that stuff. And for the most part, the record books, though they have sold well, they certainly haven't sold as well as I would like to think they could have. But like I say, it's just the very nature of the book. My Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, which was my first book published by the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul, that book is a history of pro wrestling. It says Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, but it's basically a history of Minneapolis territory wrestling and the AWA, etc. And that book outsells the 3 record books. I can't tell you, it's just triple, 4 times, 5 times as much. So people are more interested in history than they are in results.
Yeah, I could definitely see that, even though I would disagree with some of those people, because I think there is way more than just the results in these books, like you said. I mean, I'm flipping through the 70 to 74 one right now. There's pictures. You get to see the programs. I mean, you can follow more than just the results. You can see what was going on at the time, what the programs were highlighting, and then, like I said, even your narrative about what was going. So even though it might read as a results book, I think it could also really enlighten history. And I mean, that's why I keep them close, so that we can. I use them all the time as reference, just to see, or sometimes I just start reading one, and 2 hours later I've just gotten through about 20 pages because I'm just so fascinated by a certain year or something, and I feel like I've learned a lot about a certain time period. So that's great.
Well, you and I are on the same page on that.
Yeah.
And I can tell you for a fact that they're just, the audience is limited, and the Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling book, outsells both of the three other books that we've been talking about today.
Okay.
So
yeah, and
the audience is not as big, but they're still fun to do them. And let me point this out. I do not do any of these books, nor am I doing the one that I'm working on right now that I'm just not going to reveal the actual story behind it at this point. But I don't do these books for the idea that they're going to sell a lot of copies or anything like that. I do them because I want the history recorded, and I do them because I enjoy the research and enjoy compiling it and seeing it in one place as an easy reference. And to me, that's more important than selling, a lot of books at a book signing or on Amazon or whatever. I just think it's more fun to share the history. And so, that's where I come from. I just want the history told, and I want fans to get it right. And I'm always open, Tim. If somebody has a question or they want to talk about wrestling, one of the things that I get really a kick out of is when I go to some of these book signings, we have a little Q&A session. And it's really fun to have fans ask about certain wrestlers or bring up names that, holy cow, we forgot about that guy. It's been so long since he ever got talked about. And you can tell a little history on him. And I do very much enjoy going on our local radio station here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. About 3 or 4 times a year, I'm on with Patrick Royce on the 1500 ESPN AM dial in Minneapolis. And it's all about wrestling. We just have fans talk about their favorites. We give them history on it, or I give them the history on it. And I enjoy that. I enjoy sharing the information.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and some of those fans grew up they aren't the diehard fans, but they appreciated it and they remembered some of the fun from their past, and this is a way that you can help them and share your love of the sport with them to do that. So, yeah, I think
what's really strange is just yesterday on my wrestling Facebook page, I had one of the guys that is on the page, is a member of the page. He sent me a private message, and he started explaining a match that the Crusher was in. He says, I think it was the first match I went to, and he said, I think it was 1968 or 1969, and it was the Crusher against the Vachon brothers. And I'm sorry I can't give you any information. He said, do you know anything about this? Well, I don't know why, but I immediately said to myself, okay, yes, it was 1968, and I went to my program collection, I pulled out the match, or the card, the program, and I sent him the information. I said, here's the results to the card, here's the program. I sent him a copy of it, a scan of the program, and he comes back and he says, you're amazing. And I said, well, that may be true, but I can't remember if I ate breakfast this morning or not, but I can remember this stuff. That's the fun of it. If somebody tells me they saw a certain wrestler, because I've had people do this, they'll say, well, I used to live in Houston, and I used to go to the matches down there. Well, they can tell me who they saw, and I can tell you what year it was that they were there. And again, I can't remember if I ate breakfast this morning. So I may be a weird freak of nature. I don't know.
and if you're ever in one of those wrestling trivia contests, call George and bring him along, because I think he would be someone you'd want on your team. Well, this has been great today, George. Giving the listeners of this channel the chance to learn about 3 of your books. We're hoping on a future show, as we continue to do these book reviews, that we'll have you back, and then we'll talk just about the Minnesota Golden Age of wrestling, because that's another one of my favorites, and like you said, a different one. And maybe down the line, as you have more books to come out, we would love to have you on for those type of things too. And also for one of our programs we call AWA Unabridged. We'd love for you to be a guest on that, as we just talk some AWA wrestling, and that sounds like something that you talk about a lot. But is there anything you want to tell people as we wrap up this book review? And this isn't like I don't think this turned out to be our typical book review, because I think we told more stories than we actually talked about the book. But like George said, these are just record books, very well compiled record books, and they're not going to be for everybody, but they are going to be for the die-hard historians and anyone who just wants to learn about what was going on in wrestling. It's so fascinating. But just, if you enjoyed this last hour of sharing wrestling stories, hearing some behind the scenes stuff, and just getting to talk wrestling, these books are definitely for you, because this is what it's like. We have George Schire live, and if you can't always get George Schire live, so then get George Shire's books, and you can read them anytime you want to, even in the middle of the night. You don't have to worry about calling and waking him up, because you can just grab the book off your bookshelf, and you'll get to see some of the stories take place in print. And so, yeah, this has been great.
I had one of the people that I sold the book to. He told me. And at first I thought I was going to be insulted by this. But he told me, he says, I enjoy your book whenever I go into the bathroom. And I kind of looked at him and I went, oh, man. But then I thought about it. I thought, you know what? I'm taking it as a compliment. Because if the man's in the bathroom and he's spending an hour reading my book, that guy's cool with me.
Yep.
That said, I personally am not a fan of reading a book or anything in the bathroom, but I did find that funny, and him and I have joked about that a few times since. That, have you read anything good in the bathroom lately? But I thought that was entertaining, to say the least. I want to thank you, Tim. You've been very kind. You have, you've applauded me in my efforts, and I truly, truly appreciate that. Like I say, it's a labor of love. I love talking old wrestling. I love sharing old wrestling. And I would be honored to come on your show anytime and talk about not only the AWA, but any other territories in the United States that you care to talk about. I'm thinking we could have a good long conversation on it, and I would appreciate it. And I hope everyone does. If they're interested, get those books at Amazon.com.
Yeah, well, I certainly... it's hard too, thinking of doing a book review with someone that I consider a friend, because it's like how do you have this bias in you and stuff like that. But these books are just great. I know we've sat and we've talked over lunch about them and stuff like that, and I can't get enough of them. And as my listeners know, I mean, I'm a wrestling fan, especially the history of wrestling. I don't want to say envy, but I do envy people like you who got to live through it, but at the same time, I'm so thankful that you're willing to share it with us, and I just want to be around to do my part and try to keep the history alive as we get into a new generation and an internet generation, that there's so many choices and stuff out, but there's such a history in wrestling, and I'm so thankful that you guys have kept it going from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and hopefully there'll be some of us that keep it going now, because in another 20, 30 years, wrestling is going to be very different, and they're going to want to know what happened during the Attitude Era. They're going to want to know what happened during 2017 and what it was like with now, because in 2050, 2017, wrestling is going to feel really crazy. But this is what this channel is all about. If you love AWA, you'll find a lot more AWA choices on this channel and other book reviews as well. But please subscribe, and because, like I said, we'll probably have George on again real soon, and we'll go from there. So thanks so much for joining us today, George, and